Namaste. We are here with Dr. Kundan Singh, who's visiting us from the US. For our viewers, I'd like to read out his very illustrious bio. He is the core doctoral faculty at the Hindu University of Florida. He is a senior fellow at Hindupedia, California. He is the vice president of the Cultural Integral Fellowship. He is the former core faculty at Sophia University, California, adjunct faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He has authored The Evolution of Integral Yoga, Sri Aurobindo, Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. He has also contributed several chapters in edited books on issues of postmodern philosophy of science and Indian Darshana systems. He has authored this book, Making Children Hindu-Phobic, a critical review of McGraw-Hill's world history textbooks with Krishna Maheshwari. Krishna Maheshwari is an MBA from Harvard Business School, Masters and Bachelors in Computer Science from Cornell University. He is the founder and CEO of Hindupedia. Welcome, Dr. Singh.
Thank you.
To begin our discussion, please outline a brief history of the California textbook case which brought along the publication of this book, and what was your role in the same?
Sure. So before I begin to talk about my role, I would want to talk about the paradigm in which the framework of California schools is structured.
Okay.
So basically, the California legislature, it gives content standards to California Department of Education.
Okay.
The California Department of Education constitutes what is known as Instructional Quality Commission.
Okay.
Instructional Quality Commission creates a framework which it gives to publishers for the creation of various textbooks. Once these textbooks are ready, then the commission creates various subcommittees for the textbooks to be evaluated on certain standards. And once the committees have vetted those textbooks, then they become available for adoption in various school districts.
Right.
So this is the process, and Instructional Quality Commission basically meets every 10 years for the evaluation and the re-evaluation of framework, in which it seeks representations from professors, teachers, students, parents, community leaders, community activists, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And based on those representations, if it finds that there are certain erroneous aspects to the framework, then it removes those aspects and creates a new framework.
Right.
So this time, the framework in California for the school kids was re-evaluated between years 2015 and 2017. And it was in this phase of evaluation and re-evaluation that I was part of this process.
Right.
So let me tell you how actually I got involved in this.
Okay.
This was sometime in February or March of 2016. And there was one particular organization in the Bay Area by the name of Hindu Education Foundation, which contacted me and told me that bunch of professors who teach at various universities in California and the US, who call themselves as South Asia scholars, have come together and petitioned IQC that India should be replaced with South Asia and Hinduism should be replaced with religions of South Asia.
Okay.
And it was quite evident to me that in this process they were basically erasing the identity of India and also Hinduism.
Absolutely.
And because I'm familiar with the colonial and the Orientalist discourse which had been unleashed on India, for about 200 years before India became independent, I also knew that this impulse had the colonialist connections.
Okay.
In the sense that the British Indologists, right from the very beginning, they have stated that Hinduism is nothing but a ragtag collocation of many different traditions. There is inconsistency within the tradition, there is incoherence, and it was basically the Neo-Vedantic movement, beginning with Swami Vivekananda, that actually got these traditions together, removed the inconsistencies and the contradictions that existed, and created something which is known as Hinduism today.
Okay.
So I'm familiar with this discourse. I'm familiar with what the Indologists have spoken about, and I also am familiar with what is going on in mainstream academia with respect to the creation of Hinduism, Neo-Vedanta movement, and so on and so forth.
Right. Right.
So I could very clearly see the colonialist connection, in terms of the substitution of Hinduism with religions of South Asia.
Right.
However, in the petition that I wrote for IQC, I did not mention this, but I spoke about why India should not be replaced with South Asia.
Okay.
And in doing that, what I did was that I spoke about the mention of India as one geographical entity in Greek and Roman records.
Okay.
We have a long history of India having been represented as one single geographical unit by chroniclers and historians from across the world.
Right.
And because people in the West are familiar with Greek and Roman thinkers, I deliberately situated and located my arguments around the Greek and Roman thinkers / historians.
Okay.
Simultaneously, what happened was that Krishna Maheshwari from Hindupedia and Vamsi Jaluri from another university in San Francisco came together and created this petition called Scholars for People.
Okay.
And I provided them, the research that I was doing, which actually went into the petition that I wrote for IQC.
Okay.
And this petition was put on the web, and signatures were sought, and about 27,000 signatures were raised by people of Indian origin from across the world, saying that India should not be replaced with South Asia, and religions of India should not be replaced with Hinduism. And IQC did take cognizance of the discomfort that was within the community, and it decided against the replacement of South Asia and religions of,
The other
whatever that
Right.
term was at that point in
Right.
time. So this was the beginning of my involvement, and as I told you, I'm quite familiar with the colonialist and the Orientalist discourse. So once this process was over, the petitioning with regards to non-erasure of India and and Hinduism, I started taking a critical look at the framework which discusses India and Hinduism.
Right.
And I could very clearly see deeper Orientalist and colonial constructions. At that point in time, Hindu Education Foundation and Hindu American Foundation, they put together a coalition of scholars who wrote another petition to IQC, pointing out some more problems within the framework. But what I found interacting with many of the faculty as we were putting together that petition, that there was a certain discomfort with respect to calling spade a spade and stating that, you know, there are explicit Orientalist and racist connotations existing within the framework, and that for this or these reasons alone, we need to completely overhaul the framework.
Right.
So in my assessment, though the framework which eventually got released in 2017 was better than what was in existence 10 years ago, it still has a lot of problems. I am not satisfied with the framework which is in existence today.
Right.
So once the framework was finalized, I took a critical look at it again.
Right.
And what I found was that 80% of the framework was discussed along caste lines. 80%.
Even after your recommendations have been accepted?
Even after my recommendation, even after the petition that this coalition of scholars made to IQC, in spite of numerous petitions which students of Indian American origin went to IQC and mentioned the impact which it has on their identity formation in terms of the bullying that they experience from their peers and so on and so forth.
Because of the text books.
Because of the text. In fact, Hindu American Foundation has done a study and it has found that the narrative which is fed to the Indian American children in the United States on India and Hinduism impacts their identity formation to such an extent that they dissociate themselves from Hinduism and heritage of their ancestors.
They're shamed by it?
Yes, very quickly in their life. And it sort of creates intergenerational struggle, within families.
Of course.
And ultimately what it does is that it creates intrapsychic struggles within them.
Okay.
And for people who are familiar with psychology, a proper identity formation is extremely important for its transcendence if you look at it from a psycho-spiritual standpoint. It is only the ego which has been properly formed which can actually be transcended. Ego which has not been formed properly will not only not get transcended, but it also will have a baggage of what we call shadows.
Right.
And there this, and
an alienation, of
yes,
course.
In the entire lifetime across the developmental span, there is this struggle which is going on within the individuals. So the impact is very, very strong, and this has been documented by the Hindu American Foundation.
All right.
So it's not only what I as an individual did in this, but despite the collective effort which was put in this direction by the Indian American community, that the shift did not happen to the extent that it should have happened.
Right.
And I was so disgusted by that process, as I told you, that when I looked at the framework, I found that 80% of the framework on India and Hinduism was revolving around caste, And the moment we talk about caste, it basically means hierarchy and oppression.
Absolutely.
So the equation that emerges, in the textbooks is Hinduism is equal to caste, is equal to hierarchy, is equal to oppression. This is what you actually get. And this equation gets explicitly and implicitly taught
in the classrooms,
in the textbooks. And this is basically what I pointed out. And as I was pointing out, this essentialization of Hinduism along the caste lines, I also pointed out, how the education codes which have been given to the state of California by US Constitution were getting violated.
Right.
So, the two letters that I have spoken about, they are actually part of this book. They are in the appendices section. So the first one basically talks about existence of India as a geographical entity in Greek and Roman records, and the second one is basically talking about the essentialization of Hinduism along caste lines and the violation of various California education codes.
Education codes.
Yeah,
right.
That that happen once you have this kind of a narrative.
True. Dr. Singh, as I read this book, I found that it's a very balanced offering of pure research as well as very simple explanations. So, who did you have in mind as your audience when you wrote this book?
So, I would want to make it very clear that this book is semi-academic in orientation.
Right.
It is not purely academic, and there's a reason behind this. This has specifically been written to raise awareness amongst the Indian American parents and Hindus across the world to become aware of the problems that exist in framework and subsequently in
in fact in all the
textbooks.
texts that we read,
right,
we can read through this lens.
That's right. See, the thing is that when parents read what is being taught to their children, they are aware of the problems, but they do not know the nature of the problem.
Okay.
They do not know the extent of the problem.
Right.
And so, there's a certain kind of emotional dis-ease within them, but they are not able to intellectually articulate
what the
problems are.
Exactly.
So what I'm doing in this book is that I'm specifically, or rather I should say, Krishna and I, we are specifically pointing out that the contents have colonialist and orientalist connections, and at the same time they violate the sacrosanct education codes.
Okay.
So the next time that they go to IQC or any such organization, organization anywhere within the United States, they are able to talk about these problems in very, very clear ways.
Right.
So in a certain sense, this has been written to create a movement amongst the people so that the change can happen.
Absolutely.
And it's semi-academic because we wanted whatever we are saying to be based in evidence and literature which is already in existence in mainstream academia.
Right. So, Dr. Singh, you analyzed the McGraw-Hill textbooks.
That's right.
So, can you tell us how do they treat the Aryan invasion theory, which has been debunked more number of times than I care to mention, but they still kind of hold on to these ideas.
Right.
So, how do they do it and why?
So, before I come to this question, I want to add one more thing. I want to add how Krishna and I came to writing this book actually.
Okay.
So I was telling you, the problems that I found in the framework, and this was perhaps May or June of 2017. I would say May. My father suddenly fell ill, and I had to come to India, and I was taking care of him for the next 5-6 months. So I was not able to get involved in this process as much as I would have wanted. So in the meantime, what happened was that Krishna, with some other members of Hindupedia and people of the other two organizations that I have mentioned, Hindu American Foundation and Hindu Education Foundation, got together and they started writing critiques of the books created by publishers from the framework that had been adopted by the Instructional Quality Commission.
Right.
And Krishna's critique on the draft books of HMH was very well done. And what happened in the process was that the draft books of HMH.
What is HMH, Dr. Singh?
Harcourt, Mifflin. I'm not remembering, what
This
the
is a
other
publishing
H.
house?
Yes, this is a very famous publishing house actually.
Right.
So I usually mention the abbreviation, so I don't remember the full form.
Never mind.
But we can look it up. What it stands for. But definitely Harcourt, Mifflin.
Right.
In terms of in terms of H and M in HMH. So what happened was that the two draft textbooks of HMH were rejected.
Okay.
And the letter that Krishna Maheshwari from Hindupedia had written to IQC was cited for 50 citations or 50 reasons for the rejection of HMH. And you can say that it was for the first time that the Indian American community or the Hindu American community in the United States had made some dent in the process. Okay. Because this is huge. The stocks of HMH took a massive hit. And this basically sent shudders, across the publishing world.
Absolutely.
So now what has happened is that the publishers have become much more open to working with people who are pointing out problems in their textbooks.
Right.
So that's one part of the story, which I did not narrate earlier. Now let me come to your question. We all know that at best the Aryan invasion migration theory has been completely debunked.
True.
At worst it is controversial. Right?
Right.
Numerous people, numerous scholars have done extensive work in this area. Many archaeologists, have spent 25-30 years in this field, and they have not found one single piece of evidence which actually justifies or substantiates either the invasion of the Aryans or the migration of the Aryans.
True.
Right? And these papers have been published in various international fora. And despite that, what you find is that the textbooks and McGraw-Hill's textbooks are included in that list. They still talk about the Aryans.
Yes.
If they are not talking about the invasion of the Aryans, they are talking about the migration of the Aryans. And in my assessment, the migration of Aryans is basically a politically correct way of saying that the Aryans invaded the Indian subcontinent at one point in time.
True.
The logical thing is that if you have not found any piece of evidence, in terms of the coming of the Aryans, then you would say that, that this theory is bogus. But the unfortunate part is that this theory, the Aryan invasion theory, it has morphed itself, and it has become politically correct in the sense that, we all know that the term Aryan is racist in origin.
Absolutely.
The German Indologists, they sort of locked on to this term, and because of their own political reasons in the 19th century, they created this idea of pure Aryan race,
right,
which was appropriated, by the Nazis, and we all know the Holocaust, that happened, through the appropriation of this term.
True.
So we all know that the term Aryan is extremely racist in origin,
Absolutely.
right? And because the race theories or the discourse on race has completely debunked this fact that there is nothing scientific about race.
True.
In current times, nobody will use Aryans as a race, right? And that's what's happening in the textbooks also.
Right.
But, instead of saying that this was a racist theory, let's be done with it, the term that these textbook writers are using is people with Indo-European languages.
And what is
you
this?
see my point?
Yes.
So this is basically to delude. This is a sleight of hand, basically.
Absolutely. Because it means more or less the same thing.
It basically means the same thing, right? And despite this lack of evidence. So it is deeply problematic in the sense that despite the fact that there has been so much research which has been generated controverting, the Aryan invasion theory or the Aryan migration theory, that this theory still continues, right?
Yes.
Or let's say, for instance, I'm not saying that they should completely debunk this theory,
Okay.
What I'm saying is that even if they say that there are two equally powerful contentions in academia at this point in time,
Create
one,
doubt
yes, yes,
in the reader's mind.
yes, or saying that so that the teacher, the teacher as well as the student
is curious
investigates for himself or herself and finds out, what that reality is.
True.
But despite so much of generation of evidence against this theory, this theory is still being taught as veritable truth, and this is extremely problematic, because we know that there are no there's no archaeological evidence. In terms of linguistic evidence, there are scholars from India, for instance, Srikant Talagari, who has very clearly shown that the migration in fact could have happened from India. I am not interested, I'll make it very clear to you,
True.
that I am not interested in out of India thesis at this point in time.
Right.
All that I am saying is that if evidence has been not found, for the coming of the Aryans, it should not be taught as such. And the third category is, is genetic research, and there also, there's a lot of controversy.
True.
There's one set of scholars who are clearly saying that, that there's no genetic evidence. There's another set, which is saying that there are, some pieces of evidence. But what has happened is that even in this field, the clarity has not emerged.
Right.
And given these controversies, this racist theory, which was actually put in place during the colonial times, should not be taught as such.
Right.
This is, this is what my reasonable and reasoned understanding is.
Absolutely.
And I feel that it should certainly get represented in the textbooks. I mentioned this in our book, Making Children Hinduphobic, and I have written a couple of academic papers also on this particular issue, and they're in the process of becoming chapters in edited books. So once those chapters become available, I'll certainly make them available for people to read.
Right. Dr. Singh, you have mentioned in your book that the books view Hinduism as a ragtag coalition of many different religions. What does this mean to you, and what does this mean when the McGraw-Hill books say it in the texts?
So, when you ask me this question, I want you to go through something which British Indologist James Mill wrote way back in 1817. And I have emphasized this over and over again, that many of the pieces of discourse that you find on India and Hinduism today are directly connected with what was written by British Indologists.
Right.
So, taking a leaf out of that assertion, I would want to read to you something which James Mill has written about Hinduism.
Right.
And you, as well as the people listening to this interview, will be able to join the dots together, and they will be able to see the connections themselves. So, in History of British India, Volume 1, between pages 385 and 387, James Mill writes, "No people, how rude and ignorant soever, who have so far advanced as to leave us memorials of their thoughts in writing, have ever drawn a more gross and disgusting picture of the universe than what is presented in the writings of the Hindus. In the conception of it, no coherence, wisdom, or beauty ever appears. All is disorder, caprice, passions, contest, portents, prodigies, violence, and deformity. It is perfectly evident that the Hindus never contemplated the universe as a connected and perfect system, governed by general laws and directed to benevolent ends. And it follows as a necessary consequence that their religion is no other than primary worship, which is addressed to the designing and invisible beings who preside over powers of nature according to their own arbitrary will and act for some private and selfish gratification. The elevated language which this species of worship finally assumes is only the refinement which flattery, founded upon a base apprehension of divine character, engrafts upon a mean superstition."
Okay.
Before I continue, I want to read to you another one. This is on page 334. It is all vagueness and darkness, incoherence, inconsistency, and confusion.
Okay.
It is one of the most extravagant of all specimens of discourse without ideas. The fearless propensity of a rude mind to guess where it does not know
never exhibited itself in more fantastic and sensible forms. So do you see the connection?
I see a lot of
You know, do you see
Prejudice.
where this discourse is coming from?
yes.
And this is part of our larger project. You know, I'm working on another book, which basically looks at the discourse of James Mill, and I am you know, going to connect very clearly what we experience in the textbooks today with what James Mill unfolded on
Okay.
Hinduism in India, you know, about 200 years ago.
Okay.
So let me talk a little bit about James Mill. You know,
Right.
why does this book or
Absolutely.
this gentleman become important? History of British India in 3 volumes was published in 1817,
Okay.
and this was after 9 years of research that James Mill had put in.
Okay.
And for the entire period, James Mill was financially supported by East India Company.
Okay.
So East India Company was invested in the creation of this
Discourse.
textbook.
Right.
You know, and in the first volume itself, he has written 7 chapters on the Hindus.
And,
And
after
in these 7 chapters, you will be hard pressed to find one positive representation of and on Hindus.
and this is after how many years of living in India, Dr. Singh?
He never came to India. James Mill never came to India.
And he wrote this book.
Yes, and he wrote History of British India.
Okay.
Yeah, and he explains in the preface itself, you know, why it is not necessary
To visit
for
India.
for a historian to visit India in order to write
A book on India.
a book or you know, a book on India or its history. Now, this book became the standard textbook for East India Company as it was training its officers who were serving in India. Later, on this material, Cambridge and Oxford built on their narratives.
Okay.
And as time progressed, you know, this narrative became part of the various institutions and universities that the Britishers created here in India.
So basically, their history is based on anecdotal fallacy. They heard some instances from somewhere, quoted these instances into their books, and made them the truth.
No, not only that. I mean, you know, I would say that you are being very generous in assessing James Mill. The agenda was very clear. The agenda was to show, you know, how uncivilized, brute, savage the Hindus and Indians were. You know, so that the white man's burden of civilizing India could actually be justified.
Absolutely.
You know, that was the agenda, and that agenda was extremely explicit. Post-colonial studies, you know, of which you know, Said's Orientalism is an integral part. You know, can do such kind of analysis, but it is unfortunate, you know, that the post-colonial Hindu study, you know, post-colonial studies hasn't really evaluated the material, you know, which James Mill left, you know, on Hindus and India.
Okay.
So, because this narrative, you know, which was put in place by James Mill, became part of the normal and regular narrative that it forms still continue in mainstream discourse. What has happened is that this very noxious discourse has become politically correct. That is the only thing that has happened.
It's become acceptable now.
It has become acceptable, right?
Right.
And because the critical analysis or deconstruction of this discourse and its continued effects or influence on current narrative hasn't happened,
It remains correct.
that that the narrative continues. So the idea that I have is that we need to critically examine and deconstruct this discourse and see its influence on the materials which are being taught in schools and universities, so that so that people worldwide can actually become aware of what is actually happening. This is treacherous.
It is.
This is treacherous. What is happening, and it's very, very unfortunate that the mainstream academia, which lauds itself for its liberalness, does not look at the political incorrectness of this discourse, and in fact, in conscious and unconscious ways, it replicates that discourse.
Dr. Singh, this brings me to think that a self-professed academia from the US who pride themselves on extensive research and going deep into any field have missed this kind of discourse, and they continue to replicate it without informing themselves of the fact that this is rather this is an antithesis to Hinduism. What I heard from you just now is rather a flagrant interpretation of Hinduism, which is absolutely incorrect and false. How has this academia overlooked the fact of this?
See, the West for a very long period of time has engaged in othering. When the hegemony of West was uncontested over non-West, there were many different sections, of people that they could other.
Right.
They could other Native Americans, they could other Africans, they could other Muslims, they could other Hindus and Indians, they could other, Chinese people, and so on and so forth.
Right.
But what has happened now is that it has become absolutely politically incorrect to other either the Native Americans or the blacks or the Hispanics or the Muslims or the Chinese people. But because a certain self-reflexivity of Western cosmology hasn't happened, that the West hasn't rid itself of its own propensity to other and project its own shadows onto that created other.
Okay.
So at this point in time, which is very unfortunate, Hindus are the politically correct category on which all the junk
can be unloaded. Okay. So
You
we
see my
remain,
point?
we remain the whipping boys.
Yes.
Okay.
So, it's like, so in academia, anybody can say anything about the Hindus, any contestation, of whatever has been said on the Hindus or what is being said on the Hindus gets very easily conflated, with right, with fascism,
Yes.
with murder of Gandhi, Nazism, and so on and
Yes.
so forth.
Yes.
This is basically because of this process of creating the other and projecting one's own shadows onto the other.
So I think the academia also needs to reflect deeply
Absolutely.
upon themselves.
Self-reflexivity is extremely important, for psycho-spiritual growth. This is what, the classical Indian tradition, has continually emphasized. Hinduism has emphasized this, Buddhism has emphasized this, Jainism has emphasized this.
Right.
It is extremely important to critically self-reflect, reflect on yourself, reflect on the categories that you have built for yourself.
Yes.
And once you critically examine those categories that you have been that you have built for yourself, then you gain the propensity to transcend.
Those.
And that can never happen, until unless your gaze turns inwards. You start looking within, and it's only through looking within that that you transcend and transform.
True.
And my thesis is that what is true psychologically is also true sociologically.
Okay.
So in order for the West, to get rid of this propensity to other, at some point in time, it will need to bring self-reflexivity on a very wide scale
That's true.
within academia, if it really wants to transform the discourse and transform its tendencies to other and project shadows onto the other.
Right. Dr. Singh, you have mentioned in your book about the fault lines that the McGraw-Hill textbooks create between Buddhism and Hinduism. How do they do it, and why is it that they keep on doing it?
Right. So I was telling you about James Mill, and I also mentioned that it would be very difficult for anyone to basically find one positive representation, on the Hindus, and that his ideas were very explicit to show Hindus and Hinduism in a very, very poor light, so that the colonial control of East India Company could continue, or the missionaries could come and convert.
Right.
And as he was doing this, what he did was that he made Hinduism a tradition or religion which is extremely hierarchical and oppressive. Right?
Yes.
So when Buddhism is spoken about, the textbook is not really talking about in great detail or as a central focus, that it was basically because of the existential crisis that Buddha underwent.
Right.
By seeing a diseased person, an old person, a dead person, and a monk on whose face there was no trace of suffering, that he became inclined to pursue truth for the sake of truth.
Right.
Right? Instead of highlighting this in a very, very significant way and putting focus, what the text begins to describe is that Buddha was extremely dissatisfied with the caste nature of Hinduism or its rituals involving animal sacrifices. Now, in my understanding, this is a huge distortion of truth.
Absolutely.
Because if you look at the 4 ashramas, what is it that you find towards the end of one's life? In the final chapter of one's life, one is expected to take sannyas.
Absolutely.
And basically find the truth for himself and herself. And I'm deliberately using herself, because the institution of sannyas was open to women hermits as well.
True.
We get that evidence very, very clearly in Arthashastra.
Yes.
So what does that mean? And at the same time, if one got inspired to pursue the spiritual truth, even before he or she reached the final stage of his or her ashrama life, he or she could basically exit the fourfold order by providing for his or her family.
Okay.
It was extremely important that the individual provided for his or her family.
They fulfilled that part of the ashram
Right.
before transcending.
Before exiting the fourfold order.
Right.
So the idea of pursuing the truth for the sake of truth and finding truth in one's experience or existence was something, and to a large extent I think is still very, very common within the Hindu society. And when I look at what Siddhartha Gautama or Buddha did, was that he followed something which was enshrined within the society. You know, he got inspired to pursue truth for the sake of truth, and he exited the fourfold order, right? Where is this conflict, you know, with Hinduism
True.
Coming about? This conflict, you know, is actually fabricated. It's created.
Yes.
And of course, you know, I mean, in today's narrative, despite the fact that we have overwhelming evidence of the fact that it was invaders, you know, from the Middle East who destroyed the monasteries and the universities
Yes.
in India, you still have the narrative that it was basically the Brahmins who drove the Buddhists away from India. And where does that narrative come from? You know, you will be able to find its source in James Mill again. And I'll give you a quote. This is on page 360. But though Buddha is by the Hindus regarded as a manifestation of the divine being, the sect of the Buddhists are regarded as heretical and are persecuted by the Brahmins. It is conjectured that at one time, a great number of them had been compelled to fly from the country and spread their tenets in various directions. The religion of the Buddha is now found to prevail over the greater part of the East, in Ceylon, in farther peninsula, in Tibet, in China, and even as far as Japan. So what is commonly accepted today, that the Buddhists were persecuted and banished from India.
And that is why they travel to these other countries.
Right. So what was conjecture at one point in time has become the mainstream narrative today. And again, you know, you find the genesis of that narrative in the writings of James Mill. And this is the kind of critical reflection that I am talking about. This is something that we really need to do.
That's true. In a similar manner, Dr. Singh, you've also mentioned that the books target Indian polity and governance as being rather petty and rather limited in their scope and imagination, as to not being able to do much good to the society, and that's why they had to take in influences from other civilizations. How does this happen in the books, and what is the counter argument to this?
You know, there's no counter argument actually, you know, to tell you very honestly. It's just the exploration, you know, of what was in existence in the ancient times by looking at the tenets that are there in Dharma Shastras, you know, and to a smaller extent in Artha Shastra with regards to governance,
right?
You know, and comparing those with what is the dominant and accepted narrative in today's academia. And what you find is that there's a huge divergence. I won't go into the details. But the very fact that the Hindus created a hierarchical form of governance in which oppression was the norm is again something, you know, which has been built by Mill and regurgitated by people who came later or who took inspiration from James Mill. And you know, in fact,
if you can quote,
I will be yes, I will. I'll definitely quote you that on page 202 of History of British India. James Mill writes, among the Hindus, according to the Asiatic model, the government was monarchical, and with the usual exception of religion and its ministers, absolute. So that the Hindus created an absolutist form of governance and government is something, again, which he talks about, and this has become the established trope in mainstream academia today.
So, Dr. Singh, what are your long-term plans regarding this work that you have begun, and you have been largely successful in your efforts as well? What do you foresee?
So, as I mentioned to you in our conversation, I'm working on a book, which is making very, very explicit, the connections that you find in the textbooks of school-going children in the United States with the writings of James Mill.
Okay.
So that's project number one. And during the course of conversation, I also told you that despite the existence of post-colonial studies, it doesn't seem that the mainstream scholars, who are working within the field of post-colonial studies, have actually taken cognizance of what James Mill wrote on the Hindus. So when I joined the Hindu University of America, or in fact, as I was joining the Hindu University of America, my explicit plea, to the interim president was that I would create a stream of thought titled Post-Colonial Hindu Studies.
Okay.
And in this particular category, or in this particular concentration, we are going to look at various kinds of literature that are colonial and Orientalist in orientation.
Right.
So it's a two-pronged process, if you will. The first one involves deconstruction, which basically is looking critically at the narrative which is in existence in mainstream today.
Right.
And reconstruction. And by reconstruction, I mean, the creation of the worldview or the ideas with which the Hindus related and lived when the civilization was thriving.
Okay. Our original roadmap and blueprint.
Beg your pardon?
That's
right. That's right.
Roadmap
That's
and
right.
blueprint.
That's right. Because every civilization, has a cosmology. The West has a cosmology.
Right.
The Indians have a cosmology.
Which James Mill denounced in very, very strong
Absolutely.
words.
And by that I mean to say that there is epistemology, there is methodology for knowledge pursuit.
Right.
So when you look at the West, what you find is that mind is their ultimate limit in terms of knowledge pursuit.
True.
Right? So basically, they either involve their mind or their senses or an interaction of both in the creation of knowledge, right?
True.
When they are specifically focused on senses, right? And when they explore the world using their senses, then what you have is this philosophy by the name positivism. When they use their reason and mind and logic, it gives birth to rationalism, right? So you have these faculties which are dominantly operative within the Western world,
Yes.
in terms of knowledge pursuit. What do you find, in the classical Indian cosmology?
Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, they might differ in terms of their enunciation with respect to ultimate reality,
Yes.
right? But they all will say that truth can only be discovered by transcending senses and mind.
Mind. Yes.
So not only you are required to transcend your senses, but also your mind. And there are elaborate ways which you find in our darshanas that speak in detail with regards to the process involving the transcendence of mind,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
And the transcendence of mind and senses, they lead to experiencing a certain kind of reality.
Yes.
And that reality, has been held as truth for us. And it is a legitimate way of accessing reality and truth.
Yes.
The West has made that illegitimate. Do we need to buy into that? Is it necessary that we internalize this discourse and say that whatever our ancestors have done is nothing but stark superstition? We can take a different viewpoint,
Yes.
which is that truth can be accessed in many different ways.
Yes.
The West has taken certain ways for accessing the truth. The Indians since antiquity have taken a very different way of accessing truth. None of these yogis are saying that you have to take their words as truth.
You can experience it for yourself.
Exactly. In fact, they make it very clear
Yes.
that you have to experience this truth yourself.
True.
In fact, if you access it through your mind or through literature, you'll get lost. That is what they are saying.
True.
Ultimately, what is it that you are supposed to be doing? You need to take these words as markers on the path to accessing truth for yourself.
True.
Right?
True.
And what was experienced, what was revealed, became the font for our various quote unquote secular activities. Right?
True. That is true.
We need to explore that. We need to find out that core. We need to figure that out. And we need to see, how that core translated, into our sociology, into our mathematics, into our science, into our dance, into our drama, and so on and so forth.
Our entire knowledge systems.
Our entire knowledge system. So it's a big project, We are
It
working
is.
on that.
It is.
And it is for this reason that a bunch of us have come together at the Hindu University of America. We are not only revitalizing, the university, we are creating streams, concentrations, which are very, very, very different from what has happened in academia in the past. And our conviction is that this will have lasting impact on India, Indian civilization, and Indian Americans in the United States.
On these very lines, Dr. Singh, I would like your comment on one comment that Modi ji made, a statement that he made in the media. He said, ये बहुत दुर्भाग्यपूर्ण रहा है कि अंग्रेज़ी शासन के दौरान और स्वतंत्रता के बाद भी देश का जो इतिहास लिखा गया उसमें इतिहास के कुछ अहम पक्षों को नज़रअंदाज कर दिया गया. What is your opinion?
I would say that Modi ji is being very polite with this statement. Not only things that have been overlooked,
but my research of the last 20-25 years suggests that our history has been badly distorted. And mind you, viewers, I'm not a street fighter, when I'm saying this. I'm an academic. I've spent my life, with books, researching ideas. And I say this based on the sadhana or the hard work that I have put in the past, that history, Indian history, really requires a revision. It requires a revision because we are regurgitating the colonial history. The colonial history still continues, it's just that it is being fed to us in politically correct and sanitized ways. And if you do not trust me, please look into what has been written on us and about us during the colonial period. And you will be able to find the truth for yourself. This has been the Indian way. Find the truth for yourself. I am telling you, the conclusions that I have drawn based on the years of hard work that I have put in. But I am not saying that you take my word for it. What I am saying is that if you will look at the literature which was written on us during the colonial period, you perhaps will be able to see the truth of my contentions or evaluate the veracity of my contentions. Thank you.
Dr. Singh, I think you have contributed immensely to awakening Indians to India through your works, through your books, and through this interview. We thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.